This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 3.3, Part 1, on the war between the states. We just want to start off here just to kind of recap things a little bit without getting too deeply into the last 80 years of U.S. history. What we saw in the 1850s was something that, it's a little bit unfair that history treats Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan the way it does, and acts as though they didn't do anything to attempt to keep the Union together. In point of fact, they did, and we saw that in the last lecture on disintegration. The one who didn't do anything to keep the Union together and prevent the war was Abraham Lincoln. And there was a reason for this. Abraham Lincoln ran on a platform, and the Republican Party stood for a strong national government. And Lincoln wanted, once and for all, to put an end to this endemic conflict that was inherent in the U.S. Constitution that began back in 1789 and that we've seen for the entirety of our class up till now, this debate between state sovereignty and national sovereignty. Lincoln wanted to put an end to that. Well, the only way you're going to put an end to that is by establishing once and for all the supremacy of the national government. So no compromise solution is possible for Lincoln. He will then maneuver. Once Lincoln is elected, it is clear to everyone, North and South, that no compromise is going to be possible, at which point South Carolina secedes, and we saw that at the end of the last thing. Lincoln is then going to decoy Fort Sumter, which is Union-held in Charleston Harbor, surrounded on all sides by South Carolina. South Carolina wants to negotiate the surrender of Fort Sumter. Lincoln won't entertain this idea at all. Now, obviously, the Union, throughout the entire conflict, will have absolute naval supremacy. So they could easily have done one of two things. They could either have resupplied Fort Sumter, in which case it could hold out indefinitely, or evacuate the fort. South Carolina lacked the amphibious capacity to launch an actual assault against the fortress. So Fort Sumter could have held out indefinitely if Lincoln had committed to resupplying it and reinforcing it. But instead, he neither resupplies it, nor does he allow them to evacuate. This leaves South Carolina with no choice but to start an aerial bombardment, which they do. Fort Sumter surrenders. This gives Lincoln casus belli, reason for war, to launch a full-scale invasion of the South. And this is where, in the last discussion we talked, this is where he'll make his first miscalculation. Originally, he anticipates the upper South, most notably Kentucky and Virginia, staying in the Union. This, of course, will be a miscalculation. Robert E. Lee, rather than leading an army down to squash South Carolina, will in fact influence Virginia to secede from the Union as well. And he'll be overall commander of the Army of Virginia throughout the war in the Eastern Theater, which we're going to look at in considerable detail. What we have here is the matchup before the war. And what we can see from this, and we see all these figures over here, 75%, 71%, 91%, this is all for the Union. So the Union controls 75% of the wealth in the country, 75% of the farms in the country, 71% of the railroads are in Union territory, 91% of factory production, and 71% of the total population. And so really from the very get-go, what we see is that on their own, the Confederacy just doesn't have a chance. It's a foregone conclusion. Unless they can accomplish a few things that we'll look at in a minute here, on their own, the cause is hopeless. Particularly we pay attention to this factory production. One of the things that's rather unique and interesting about the war between the states, it will be the first application of the Industrial Revolution in warfare, be that in Europe or in the United States. The first in Europe will be the Franco-Prussian War, which happens just shortly after the war between the states. And so what you're going to have is mass production. We looked during the War of 1812, things like that, and we talked about at some length the Napoleonic conflicts. Well, yeah, the Napoleonic conflicts had mass armies, but they didn't have the Industrial Revolution, so they didn't have mass production of weaponry. They're going to in the war between the states, and the Union will have the overwhelming superiority on this. Okay. Winfield Scott, if you remember, we mentioned him during the Mexican-American War. Winfield Scott was the overall architect. He was not ground commander because he was too old. Zachary Taylor was the ground commander in the Mexican War. But Winfield Scott was the chief strategist for the Americans. Just prior to the beginning of the war, this is early in 1860, the winter of 1860, Lincoln calls Winfield Scott in and asks him to devise a strategy for the Union to pursue to defeat the South. And Winfield Scott's strategy is referred to as the Anaconda strategy. And it's logical and it makes sense. And it would require very little in terms of human expenditure. In other words, it would save a lot of lives. The basic idea is predicated on the concept that the Union has complete mastery over the sea. As a result of this, the first thing you're going to do is blockade all southern ports, which the Union will do. This prevents the Confederacy from trading, from exporting or importing. Okay? Well, as we've known all along and as we've talked about all along, the South is highly dependent on trade. This was one of the key points of contention between the southern states and the national government, as the national government imposed this protectionist trade regime through the early 19th century, and the South objected to it, culminating in the nullification crisis, which we talked about. Okay, so they need trade, so you cut that off. Secondly, what Scott suggests is carve the Confederacy up. First, take control of the Mississippi. This cuts off Arkansas, most of Louisiana, and all of Texas. Okay? Then, in the southeast, drive across to Atlanta. This cuts off Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida. This leaves only a small core for the Confederacy. Okay? And with Lee's army in northern Virginia, you fight a defensive war. Prevent him from crossing the Potomac. And then Lee's army of northern Virginia, which is the most significant of the Confederate forces, will simply die on the vine. If you can carve the Confederacy into pieces and blockade all their ports, it won't be necessary to confront Lee's army because Lee's army will simply run out of supplies. Lincoln doesn't want to hear this. What Lincoln wants, he wants decisively to establish the supremacy of the national government. To do that, it's not sufficient that the Confederacy be defeated. It is necessary that it be a decisive, overwhelming victory. And so Lincoln, time and again, is going to order, as commander-in-chief, frontal assaults to try to bludgeon through Lee's army in Virginia. We're going to see this at the two battles of Manassas. We're going to see this at Fredericksburg. We're going to see it at Chancellorsville. We're going to see it in the Overland Campaign at the end by Grant. Okay? And the result of this will, of course, be tens of thousands of dead. And so Lincoln kind of goes down in history as one of the great mass murderers because it was completely unnecessary to do. Now, what Lincoln is predicating his idea on is something actually that comes from Sun Tzu's Art of War. In Sun Tzu's Art of War, the greatest mistakes that a general can make are to either overestimate your own capabilities and or underestimate the capabilities of your opponent. Lincoln will do both. Okay? Lincoln understands that there is a massive, overwhelming superiority of force on his side. He's hoping that that is going to be enough to simply bludgeon through the Confederate forces, who are vastly inferior in number and vastly inferior in terms of equipment. All right? And so what's going to happen during the war between the states is the United States is going to develop a military doctrine that will last for 150 years. It continues to be the basis of U.S. military doctrine. Bring overwhelming superiority of force to bear. Okay? And this will be the case, that they will do all the way up until current times. It won't prove unsuccessful until the Vietnam conflict, because the United States brings overwhelming superiority of force, kind of tangentially, brings overwhelming superiority of force to bear on North Vietnam, but fails to succeed in its objective. But that's well beyond the scope of this class. We'll cover that in U.S. history too. Now, for the Confederacy, okay, the Confederacy is basing its strategy on two things. Okay, the first of them is that there is an understanding that support for the war in the North is at best tentative. Okay, despite what some history books would try to tell you, the vast majority of Northerners were utterly and completely indifferent to the issue of slavery. They couldn't care less. Okay? The abolitionist movement was at its very height in the late 1850s, a fringe element in the Union. Okay? Most of them were indifferent, and most of them did not want to go to war, which is why Lincoln will never put this up to any kind of popular referendum and won't consult Congress on it. Okay? Because what we have to remember is that the Northerners see the Confederacy as Americans. They're still Americans. Okay? Surely there must be some compromise solution short of all-out war. Lincoln will not have any of this. And so the support for the war is tentative. So what Lee's thinking, Lee doesn't believe in Confederacy. Jefferson Davis is the president of the Confederacy. He and Lee, they don't deceive themselves into believing that given the correlation of forces and the overwhelming superiority by the Union, that they're going to be able to succeed on the battlefield, that they're going to be able to win once and for all. But if they can inflict sufficient losses on the North, if they can impose enough costs, the North will simply lose its desire for the war, and political pressure will be brought to bear against Lincoln, forcing him to a negotiated settlement. Now, that's the first. Now, in the second case, on the second hand, the second pillar of their strategic approach, we make no deception. We saw this during the American Revolution. It is very unlikely that the Continentals in the American Revolution would have prevailed had they not had significant foreign assistance, principally from the French, who, if you'll recall, became pivotal in the Battle of the Capes. If you'll recall, de Grasse brought the French fleet up from the West Indies and decisively defeated the British fleet, and the siege of Yorktown was therefore ended, and Cornwallis had to surrender. And so the Confederacy is hoping for foreign support. Now, they have some reason to believe that foreign support might come. There are two basic reasons that they believe this. The first has to do with something, and this is not a course on European history. Nonetheless, we want to mention this. In 1848, the British passed a series of laws known collectively as the Corn Laws, in which the mercantile trade system is officially ended. Okay? They open up Great Britain and the British Empire to free trade. This is followed suit by most of the other European powers. While they're opening up the system of trade, the northern states, the national government of the United States, is perpetuating a protectionist policy. This puts them in complete conflict of interest with the Europeans in terms of trade. Well, the Confederacy favors free trade and always has. You would think then that this is a coincidence of interest between the Europeans, who are now implementing free trade, and the Confederacy, who's wanted free trade all along. That's the first. The second is that the mainstay of British industry and of much of the European industry is the textile industry, cloth. Well, that industry has been traditionally, up until the 1850s, highly dependent on Southern cotton. And so, for these two reasons, one, that the South wants free trade the same as the Europeans, that's a coincidence of interest. And two, Southern cotton is necessary to feed the textile industries in Europe. Okay? For those two reasons, the Europeans have an incentive to intervene and see the South prevail in this conflict. Okay? Now, and so what Lee wants to be able to do is if he can demonstrate on the battlefield the ability of the Confederate armies, they might get support from Europe. Reasonable enough estimation, were it not for one thing that escaped the Confederacy, that escaped their attention. In the 1840s and 50s, the British began to take control over Egypt. When they did so, they discovered growing along the Nile a superior strain of long grain Egyptian cotton, which was superior to the Confederacy's. And so they had already, by the 1850s, begun to replace Southern cotton with Egyptian cotton. And so that incentive goes away. All right. What we have here is just by way of example. We're going to cover these campaigns in considerable detail. What we have here, though, is if you look on Blackboard, you'll see that there are two, during the period that we study the Civil War, you'll see that there are two supplements. There's Supplement 1 and Supplement 2. This is Supplement 1. It's a table that just kind of gives a brief synopsis of the war, and then Supplement 2 goes into detail on the various campaigns. I just wanted to put this up there as an example. We're going to start off here in just a second with the First Manassas. We were discussing just earlier in this lecture that Lincoln's strategic approach, what he wants to do, is use overwhelming force and bludgeon through the army in Northern Virginia to push for Richmond and win a decisive early victory. Okay? Now, the reason he's going to do this is because he knows also that support for the war in the North is tentative. He only has a limited period of time before political pressure is going to be brought against him to end the conflict and negotiate a settlement. So he wants to win quickly. Okay? And so in the first run, he's going to order McDowell. McDowell will be the first of the commanders of the Army of the Potomac. He's going to order McDowell, against McDowell's better judgment, okay, to move south and try to take Richmond. Now, we want to understand something as we go into this. Abraham Lincoln never served a single day in any military force. He knows absolutely nothing about what it is to command. He knows nothing about logistical support. He is a politician. McDowell is not. McDowell is a career officer. He understands the contingencies that can arise during a conflict, okay, during war. So he understands that Lincoln is underestimating the Confederacy and overestimating Union capabilities. Nonetheless, Lincoln is commander-in-chief. McDowell is his subordinate. He has to do as he's told. So he's going to design a strategy to try to outmaneuver the Confederacy. What he wants to do is move south quickly and seize Richmond before Robert E. Lee takes command over the army. Lee is not on the scene yet. Okay, this battle will be run by Longstreet and Ewell primarily. Okay, now as the two armies come close at Manassas, now the reason this is First Manassas and Bull Run is the different way that the Union and Confederacy name battles. The Confederacy names it for the closest town or the closest village. The Union tends to name it after the closest physical boundary waterway. And so the Bull Run, this is on the Bull Run River, close to the town of Manassas. You see the town of Manassas here. You see the Bull Run River here. The basic idea, the Confederacy wants to come from the east and encircle the Union. The Union wants to come from the west and encircle the Confederacy. And so if you look at the general strategy, if this were to both be implemented at the same time, the two armies would circle around each other. Okay? This won't happen. Okay, what's going to happen here, and this is all this stuff, what you have here is you have a screenshot from historyanimated.com, which I encourage you with all of the earnestness at my command to consult, and to consult frequently when we get to this. I didn't narrate over it, but instead I just took these screenshots, and then I'll just give a brief synopsis of what happens in the battle. Okay, the Confederacy, as it moves across, will move north and seek to stop the Union from coming across the Bull Run. Okay, now the Union outnumbers the Confederacy by about 2-1 in this battle. The Confederacy under McDowell, or the Union under McDowell, will cross across the Bull Run piecemeal. The majority of McDowell's army will be left north of the Bull Run. On the south bank, the smaller force will come and try to overwhelm Evans and Cocke here, okay, and take a place called, there were two hills, one called, I think, Matthews Hill, and the other was Henry Hill, and try to take the high ground from which they can then launch an assault against the Confederate rear. Longstreet and Ewell bring their forces up, and in an absolute tactical wizard maneuver, they actually withdraw after very little fighting from Matthews Hill, which is the lower of the two hills, and take a commanding position on Henry Hill. McDowell will at this point attempt a series of piecemeal assaults with his brigades against Henry Hill, and all of them will be turned back. Okay? Eventually, the Union will have to withdraw and reboot and rethink. This will be for Lincoln's first, how to say it? We use a baseball term, go to the bullpen. This will be his first replacement. He'll replace McDowell. McDowell in this battle didn't really do anything wrong. Yes, he could have moved more quickly and gotten his entire army across the river. Yes, he could have coordinated his assault on Henry Hill a little bit better. Okay? There's always second guessing. But in point of fact, he was up against forces that Lincoln had no idea about. All right? But what Lincoln's convinced of is that the Union has an overwhelming superiority. Therefore, the only reason that they would ever be defeated is because of incompetent command. And so he'll replace McDowell with McClellan. Now, McClellan is another career officer. This is difficult. McClellan understands that if you attempt another full frontal assault, okay, because while this is happening, the Confederacy is massing more forces. They're rallying more troops to the cause. If you try another full-scale forward assault, the same thing's going to happen. And so McClellan comes up with an interesting tactical plan and strategic plan. The basic idea is to assemble the Army of the Potomac around D.C. and take advantage of the fact that the Union has overwhelming superiority on the ocean. They have naval supremacy. You can therefore ship with an amphibious assault, ship the entire 100,000 men, and McClellan will set sail with an army of 110,000 men. It will be the largest amphibious assault in history. Actually, it will be larger than the Normandy invasion as it works out. But at any rate, he's going to sail them down the Potomac out into the Chesapeake and swing around and take a position in this peninsula between this estuary and the James River. Magruder has 13,000 forces here. The bulk of the Confederate army is under Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley with 17,000 and under Johnston with 43,000. Lee has yet to come on the scene. Lee is on his way. Okay? And so even with these 9,000 under Huger coming up to reinforce Magruder, you'll outnumber them 5-1. You can then bludgeon your way through, and before Johnston and Jackson can mass their forces and before Lee comes on the scene from the west, you'll be able to seize Richmond and end the war quickly, which is exactly what Lincoln wants to do. Lincoln doesn't like this plan. Lincoln doesn't like it because it involves too much maneuver. He wants to try again, bludgeoning his way through, okay, at Manassas and moving south on Richmond. But he'll approve McClellan's plan. The, the main problem with McClellan's plan, on paper, it looks good. It makes sense. It's creative. It's based on maneuver. It takes advantage of the naval supremacy of the Union. Okay, it takes advantage of their superior numbers. The problem is, this is the first time in history, American history or elsewhere, that such a large-scale amphibious operation has ever been planned or operated or executed. And so they just don't have the logistical experience to bring it off. Okay? It takes much longer. You look at this. This is now in March of 1862. This campaign won't really get underway until May. It'll be 2 months before McClellan can assemble enough of an army and get enough logistical support from the fleet together to sail it south. Well, while that's happening, okay, the Confederacy is rallying more forces, and Lee is coming on the scene to take personal command. So that by the time McClellan launches his campaign and lands at the James River, okay, Lee is on the scene. Confederate forces have been reinforced to what you see here. Now, originally, when the Army of the Potomac is massing up here in Maryland and around D.C., the Confederacy believes, that it's another full-scale assault. And so they mass their forces, about 60,000, under Jackson and Ewell, or under Jackson and Johnston, rather, to defend this area. Okay, another Bull Run is what they're thinking. Then they see, and they watch, and they don't do it under cover of darkness. It's impossible to hide, the movement of 110,000 men, although the Chinese do it fairly effectively in the Korean War, but that's tangential. But at any rate, they see this, and they realize what's happening. Johnston immediately begins to move south. These forces, seeing what's happening, will rally, and what they're going to do is build a physical barrier right here between this estuary and the James River. They know that McClellan has about 110,000 men under his command. McClellan, for his part, okay, and this is one of the errors he's going to make, he insufficiently scouts the Confederate forces. He doesn't know how many there are. He thinks, in fact, Lee has availability of a lot more than he actually does. And so both sides know, the Confederacy knows that McClellan has overwhelming forces. When all is said and done, he has 120,000 men. Eventually, they'll break through this physical defense, okay, in the South. But it will delay the Union advance long enough for Lee and the Army of Virginia to assemble in a defensive position around Richmond to be able to withstand the assault. Okay, and this, in fact, will work. The one other piece that I would make mention of here is this. You see here the CSS Virginia and the USS Monitor. The CSS Virginia was actually a captured Union warship known as the Merrimack, and it was converted to an ironclad, and we'll have the first ironclad battle here to support, because for the Union offensive to be successful, they have to be able to maintain a logistical support line from Washington, D.C. across the Chesapeake. McClellan's planning then on supporting the Army through using the fleet. Okay, you just constantly continue to support them. Well, that means that you have to have naval supremacy. And so in an effort to kind of challenge it a little bit, the Confederacy will take this captured Union ship, convert it to an ironclad, and it surprises the living hell out of the Union. They sail it out fairly early on in the campaign, and will devastate parts of the Union fleet. The Union response, they've been working along similar lines, and they'll bring out the Monitor, which is actually probably a superior ironclad. It's more like a modern ironclad. It sits lower in the water. It has better armor, and instead of its guns being side guns like you have on the old wooden ships, it has a turret that will turn. So it has a 360-degree firing radius, or 360-degree firing radius, which makes it a little bit more effective. The battle is between the Monitor and the Merrimac is completely inconclusive. They'll come out the next day and do it again, and then never meet again in the war because it's inconclusive. Now, okay, so McClellan lands. He marches north. Lee will bring it on, and the main battle is going to be the 7 Days Battle, which I don't show here. You can go onto the History Animated site. But ultimately, McClellan is going to suffer from a certain timidity. He's very slow to move. The one thing that's true of McClellan that critics have always said is that he's very slow to move. He's a very cautious commander. And from the very get-go, he believes that Lee has considerably more forces than Lee actually has. All massed, Lee is going to have about 55,000 men, okay, against McClellan's 120,000. Plus, McDowell has 40. We'll discuss that in just a minute. We have McDowell with 40,000, Banks with 25,000, and Fremont with 8,000 further north. McClellan plans on bringing them south to reinforce the position. Okay, at which point he'd have overwhelming force and could overwhelm Lee's army. Lee's going to take action against that in just a minute, and we'll take a look at that in one of the most brilliant campaigns of the conflict. Of actually one of the most brilliant campaigns of any conflict ever in human history. Okay, so he'll always be, one, expecting reinforcements from the north, which will not materialize thanks to Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and two, he'll constantly suffer from the misapprehension that Lee has considerably more strength than he does. And so after a 7 days battle outside of Richmond, as McClellan's forces dwindle, he'll decide to abandon the campaign. One of the main reasons that he will decide to abandon the campaign is the tactical brilliance, true wizardry, that will be demonstrated by Stonewall Jackson in what's called the Valley Campaign, or sometimes referred to as the Shenandoah Campaign, from May to June of 1862. So this campaign is couched right in the middle of the Peninsula Campaign. Now let's just remember, McClellan sailed down here through the Chesapeake and swung around down south with his 120,000 man army. We have a 40,000 man force of the Army of the Potomac here. We have approximately another 25,000 men here. Okay? McClellan plans on them marching south and reinforcing his position, in which case they would be able to overwhelm Lee's army, take Richmond, end the war quickly. So Lee dispatches Jackson with a small force, 17,000 men, you see right here. Jackson's mission is a very simple one, okay? In no way do we deceive ourselves into believing that Jackson is going to march up through the Shenandoah River Valley and take Washington, D.C., or put significant pressure on Washington, D.C. What Lee wants Jackson to do is simply harass these three Union forces and delay them coming south. You understand? Just keep them busy. While you keep them busy, I'll be down here. This is Lee speaking. While Jackson keeps them busy in the Shenandoah Valley, Lee will be busy down here trying to achieve a decisive victory over McClellan's superior force. Okay? Because if these Union forces get down there, it's over. Jackson will march up, and for those of you who are students or like military history, this is truly something to watch. This will be the greatest tactical maneuvering in the war, okay? And it will demonstrate the tactical brilliance of Thomas Stonewall Jackson, okay? The first thing Jackson's going to do is create what he refers to as mounted infantry. He takes his infantry and puts them on horseback. They will dismount whenever they're in battle. But to maneuver, to move, they'll be mounted. So they will move very quickly and be able to outmaneuver the Union forces. Okay, and again, to go into the details of this, go to History Animated. What Jackson's going to be able to do in a series of very sharp, very quick actions, the advantage that Jackson has, which he will exploit to its fullest potential, is that these three Union forces are disassociated. Okay? They're separated. He was going to meet each of them in turn to defeat them. Defeat them piecemeal. Okay? Divide and conquer. And so he'll meet them in sharp actions, okay, and send them into retreat. He will then, which is not strictly part of his orders, but he sees the opportunity, while the Union is licking its wounds, he will march very quickly through a series of forced marches up the Shenandoah River Valley and take the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, capturing enormous amounts of Union supplies. Now, this could potentially be his undoing. And what you see here is the trap that is going to be proposed by Lincoln himself. Lincoln, who we will remember again, has never served a day in the military. Lincoln doesn't understand maneuver. He doesn't understand how difficult it is to maneuver an army in a river valley with mountains on all sides. Okay? He orders this force under McDowell and this force under Fremont to march quickly on Sharpsburg, Virginia. This will cut Jackson's army off in Harper's Ferry, okay? And they need to march there before Jackson can march south and escape the trap, okay? This will encircle Jackson's army, and it will be forced to surrender. It's an interesting plan, but it's on paper it looks good, but it's predicated on a misunderstanding, on a lack of understanding of the difficulty of logistical support and maneuver given the terrain. In point of fact, Jackson, who I just mentioned, has comprised an extraordinarily maneuverable force. After the raid on Harper's Ferry, through a series of forced marches, will dart very quickly south and escape the trap. He will then defeat in rapid succession Fremont's army and send McDowell's army into retreat, completely disrupting the Peninsula Campaign. Okay, by really the middle of June of 1862, it's very clear that no reinforcements are going to be arriving from McClellan. McClellan will be forced, therefore, to abandon the Peninsula Campaign, and the Army of the Potomac will move back up the Potomac River and kind of reboot things, kind of reassemble itself outside of Washington, D.C. And the kicker to all of this is, at the end of the 7 days battle, the critical point of the Peninsula Campaign, not only has Stonewall Jackson completely disrupted and sent into retreat a Union army over 3 times his size through a brilliant series of maneuvers and sharp, small battles, but he will actually be able to move his force south quickly enough to reinforce Lee's position at a critical moment in the battle. Okay? At which point, that's when McClellan will resign his position. Not resign his position as commander. He'll be booted out by Lincoln, but resign his position in the game. He'll be forced into retreat and go back up. And so it's truly this May-June campaign of Jackson is one of the most brilliant in military history, American or not. Okay. After the failure in the Peninsula Campaign to take Richmond, Lincoln is convinced that once again it was inept command. And so Lincoln will remove McClellan from overall command of the Army of the Potomac, and place Pope in charge of things. Now, this is going to be the first Southern Confederate offensive. While McClellan is sailing back the army from the Peninsula Campaign, the bulk of the army north, okay, what Lee wants to prevent is if McClellan comes up here and then McDowell and Pope can form up their army and join McClellan's, they can then march south again with a massed force. You see, Pope here has about 55,000 and McClellan about 90,000. So that would give them roughly 150,000 men. They'd outnumber Lee by about 3 to 1. Lee's sitting on 55,000. They would then try to bludgeon their way through and take Richmond again. So what Lee wants to be able to do is really pretty brilliant here. While McClellan is assembling, rather than pursuing, now, first of all, after the Peninsula Campaign, rather than pursuing McClellan's superior force, he lets it escape. It's going to take McClellan time. Okay, we're now in August of 62. This is at the very end of the Peninsula Campaign. It's going to take him at least 3 weeks, maybe, to get his army and supplies back on the ships and sail them north. This gives Lee an opportunity to march his army north, okay, and defeat Pope decisively before McClellan and Pope can link up and mass another full-scale campaign to move through and take Richmond. All right, this will bring up the Second Manassas, or the Second Bull Run. This time it's the Confederacy that has just about even numbers with Pope that's going to march north to drive the Union forces out of here and inflict a significant casualty. The key thing is the one thing that I took the screenshot from History Animated, which is Stonewall Jackson's flanking assault. The success of the campaign ultimately would have Lee commanding here and holding both Burnside, McDowell, and Pope here on the Bull Run. Okay, this is the Bull Run River. And Jackson taking a smaller force, crossing the Bull Run and the Rappahannock, which is right there, and encircling and coming up for a rear assault on Pope and the Union Army. Okay, this would encircle this 55,000 man force and force it to surrender. You understand the basic idea here? Again, the Confederacy is basing its strategic approach on maneuver and tactical superiority. Okay, the Union is relying on overwhelming superiority of force, and so it's important for the Confederacy to disrupt these two Union forces, the one under Pope, the one under McClellan. So as McClellan sails his north, Lee will march rapidly to engage Pope. It will be modestly successful. Jackson's flanking assault will work, but Pope will manage to salvage his position enough to have an orderly retreat across the Bull Run back to D.C., allowing the army to link up with McClellan's ultimately, and forcing Lee to reconsider his position. It will be significant enough for Lee, however. It will be unlike the first Bull Run, really is considered by most historians to be a draw, although the Confederates kind of get the edge in it. This is a decisive Confederate victory. Okay, this northern army of the Potomac is almost entirely encircled and destroyed. It suffers enormous casualties and will take some time to recover. Okay, so they're going to retreat across the Potomac. Lee doesn't pursue them particularly quickly. Instead, what Lee's going to do is mass his force and prepare for the first offensive into Union territory, which we'll have at Antietam. This follows immediately after the Second Battle of Manassas in September of 62. Lee's plan now is to take the battle to the north, where his men can live off Union territory. Up till now, all the fighting has taken place in the Confederacy. Okay, the vast majority, over 95% of the fighting, will take place in Confederate territory during the war. There will be a couple of notable exceptions, one being the Antietam campaign, the other being the Gettysburg campaign. Okay, so Lee is going to march his army north. It's going to do two things. It's one, going to threaten Washington, D.C., which is going to make Abraham Lincoln go absolutely crazy. Okay, Lincoln really starts to show what he's like as a commander, because as Lee's army moves in, he panics and actually leaves Washington. and to move further north. The idea being to come around the right flank of the Union Army and encircle it around D.C., cutting it off and ultimately destroying it. Now, the overall hope here is that this would be for the Confederacy what the Battle of Saratoga was for the Revolutionary War. For the colonials, it was after Gates and Arnold's victory at Saratoga that the French jumped into the conflict, okay, because it demonstrated that the colonials were a serious force. Lee's hoping that this will have the same effect for the Confederacy. Okay, and again, I skip kind of. You go to historyanimated.com, you can see the details of the Antietam, the Battle of Antietam. It is a relatively successful. Generally, again, the Battle of Antietam. You see, the overall strategy here is to move north and ultimately move towards Gettysburg. The Union confronts Lee at Antietam Creek. Okay, and historians generally conclude that this battle was kind of a draw. Tactically, really, Lee prevails. He forces the Union Army into retreat, but it is a relatively Pyrrhic victory. And you can Google Pyrrhus of Epirus to understand what that means. What it means is that while he was tactically victorious in the battle, strategically it was kind of a defeat. Because during the battle, he suffered sufficient casualties to prevent him from continuing the campaign. Okay, in other words, while he kind of won the battle, he expended too many forces in doing so and had insufficient reserves left to continue the campaign northward. And so Lee is going to be forced to retreat back into Virginia and cross the Potomac again. And I think we're going to conclude this lecture at Antietam. In the second one, we'll start off with another Union offensive into Virginia at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Then we'll go over Gettysburg and that kind of thing. And that will be in part 2.